During the Obama administration, civil rights became a big issue once again in Washington. The president and his Justice Department focused on voting rights, criminal justice reform, and many other issues that impact minority communities. But all the progress that they made, now arguably in jeopardy with Donald Trump in the White House and Attorney General Jeff Sessions running the Justice Department, at least for now. Well, that makes my next guest and the new book he just wrote very relevant. It's called This African American Life, and the author, former Urban League president, and so much more, Hugh Price. We recently sat down to discuss his life and his book. You know, my family, we've recently gone by our family tree and found some surprises like most people do, where the branches go and where it started versus what you thought. But I think yours has got about just about any biography I've heard beat here in terms of not just where you go, but the signposts of history that your family was eyewitnesses to. So for the sake of time that we get as much in, I'm going to ask a name and talk about that. Let's first start off with Nero Hawley, because literally he knew George Washington. He was with George Washington. I guess we start in Valley Forge.
Yeah, well, Nero Hawley was a slave who lived in Trumbull, Connecticut, just up the road. In order to get his freedom, and other slaves as well, fought in the American Revolution. So he served at Valley Forge under the command of George Washington during that hideous winter. And then he obtained his freedom after he mustered out, and he also was compensated for his time. And one of the fascinating things is I managed to purchase a treasury note that he signed in 1782, and it's signed with his ex, and I now own that. And what's also fascinating is that the Daughters of the American Revolution, which had sort of been in denial about the role of African Americans and Native Americans, finally acknowledged it with a major exhibition in the early 2000s, and some of these stories of Nero and this treasury note were part of the exhibition, which was very exciting.
In terms of memorabilia, you also have, to another member of your family, an actually wanted a poster for $50 for a runaway slave. Talk about your family's role in the Civil War and also those who fled slavery and went up to Boston, I believe.
Right. My great-grandfather and his wife, George and Rebecca Latimer, not related, as best I know, to the legislator here, escaped from Norfolk, Virginia in 1842. He was very fair-skinned. He was a mulatto. She was very brown-skinned. So they stowed away on a boat as far as Baltimore. Then they traveled, if you can believe this, they traveled as master and slave to Philadelphia, then as husband and wife to Boston the rest of the way. An employee of their slave master spotted them and triggered a process to try to recapture him. The abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison rallied around their cause and helped to prevent the recapture. And there was also a famous poem called From Massachusetts to Virginia, which was written by John Greenleaf Whittier about the Latimer case.
Unbelievable. In addition to that, you have inventors in your family.
Well, George and Rebecca Latimer had 4 children, one of whom was my great-great-grandmother, Margaret Latimer. Her brother was Louis Latimer, who was an inventor who helped Alexander Graham Bell perfect his patent application, and who also perfected the carbon filament in the light bulb invented by Thomas Edison. And Louis Latimer was a member of the Edison pioneers. The interesting thing is that when I was in college, I dated a girl who lived in Brooklyn, and I used to go up and stay with Louis Latimer's daughter, my Aunt Louise, in his house, in his bedroom, in his bed. And she always would say to me, "Come to breakfast, I want to tell you all about your famous Uncle Louis Latimer, and therefore about his parents, etc." And I said, I got to go to Brooklyn now. I got to see my girlfriend. So where do I get on the BQE? What exit do I get off to get to Mid? We'll talk about that another time. And I never did. I just blew the opportunity. Then another interesting ancestor was Robert Gunnell, who was a man who lived in McLean, Virginia. He purchased his freedom in the 1840s. He had property which was a walking distance from what is now the CIA headquarters on the other side of the Potomac. He purchased his family, and at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation was one of the largest slave owners inside the District of Columbia, and he purchased them in order to protect them from being seized by other slave owners. And he was actually compensated for the involuntary liberation of his property. So I dwelt on these stories because they illustrated the contributions of African Americans to freeing America from the yoke of colonialism under the Brits, the determination to secure freedom even if it meant owning your own family, and the contributions that our folks made to the conveniences and the modernization of America.
And then it gets to your life. No pressure with some of the achievers you had in your family and the obstacles they went over. In fact, as a young guy, you were more concerned about being a ball player than what you've turned into. But talk about first growing up in D.C., in a segregated D.C. at the time, what reality was like then.
Right. Well, the public schools were segregated. I went to a black school. The movie theaters were segregated rigidly. The restaurants downtown, with the exception of I think one or two, were segregated. If you wanted to buy some clothes in a department store downtown, you could, but you couldn't try them on. The amusement park just outside of Washington, a place called Glen Echo, was segregated. So it was a sleepy town down south. No illusions. You know, that was the real deal. Then in 1954, when the Supreme Court under Earl Warren declared that segregation in public education was unconstitutional, that sort of opened things up in the schools, and it also opened things up residentially, and families started to moving out. And I was part of the first contingent of African American students to integrate the Washington, D.C. schools in 1954. I entered the 8th grade in a school that had previously been white. So it was, I mean, I grew up in the orbit of Howard University and was supported by my family and by people who were striving to get ahead. And they taught us not to internalize the obstacles, to overcome the obstacles, but not to internalize them and think that you're a lesser being. And that ethos really carried us through a lot of difficulty.
And a defining moment for you was you were in a march in 1963.
Right,
Why was that so transformative?
Well, there were several things going on at the time. The civil rights movement was cresting. JFK had come into office and in his famous inaugural address it said, "Ask not what your country will do for you, but what you can do for your country." Martin Luther King gave the remarkable "I Have a Dream" speech. Not long after that, Kennedy was assassinated, actually on my birthday, my 22nd birthday. And LBJ declared that we will end poverty in our lifetimes. And my generation believed them. And so that, plus my mother's activism, the genes there, drew me into the career and the work that I devoted my life to.
And that career, obviously, media, a big part of it, also certainly mentoring and activism as well, and politics. Right. Talk about a little bit about the trajectory that your career took you on, not only how you also ended in the National Labor League, but also how you were involved, obviously, with public broadcasting, et cetera.
It was an interesting and unorthodox career. Started as a legal services lawyer representing poor people who couldn't pay for their own lawyers. We had riots in New Haven, Connecticut, where my wife and I lived, and that sort of drew me more deeply into community activism. And a couple of other jobs in New Haven. And in 1978, I was offered a position as a member of the editorial board of the New York Times, and that came totally out of the blue. We moved to New Rochelle in 1978, and I began writing editorials, and it was fascinating. I got to pick the overwhelming majority of the topics I wrote on, and the perspective that I developed became the perspective, the editorial perspective of the paper. After about 5.5 years, I was enjoying it, but I also began to get the itch to run things again, not just write about stuff. And I was offered an opportunity at WNET Channel 13, initially to run the station that you watch, the scheduling and fundraising. And then in 1984, I became the head of all national production, and I ran the division that produces great performances in nature, and we created series like Art of the Western World and American Masters that all happened on my watch. And that was just an exhilarating job. I mean, extraordinarily creative people, great opportunity to travel the world in search of co-production partners, sitting on the beaches in Cannes, France, cutting co-production deals. It was, you know, somebody gets paid for this.
That gig,
Somebody gets paid for this, it's okay. And then from there, I made a run for the presidency of the station in 1987, and it didn't happen. I was really disappointed. So I decided that public television had been a bit of a detour for me. So I got an opportunity to become vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation and had a lot of fun giving away other people's money. It's really very stimulating. And then the National Urban League opportunity arose, and that was something I had dreamt of doing my entire life. It's a legendary organization that's made enormous contributions to our community and to the country. And I had grown up with people like Whitney Young, who lived in Westchester, Vernon Jordan, who lived in Westchester,
Sure.
John Jacob, who lived in Westchester. Those are my role models. And so to be able to occupy the position that they had held was a dream of a lifetime come true.
Obviously, the title of the book speaks to the next question, but when you assess the trajectory that African Americans have had in this country and where we are now, and obviously just coming off 8 years of the first African American president, how do you assess last 40 years in this country, gains, maybe even ebbs and recesses from where we were? Where are we now? And is it where you thought we'd be when you first moved to New Rochelle 45 years ago or so?
Well, on the, not quite that long,
Yeah.
39.
Close to that.
On the upside, I'm not where I thought we'd be. I would never have imagined that an African American would be elected president in my lifetime, and certainly not someone named Barack Obama. The movement of African Americans into the upper reaches of our society, into the management ranks of our society, into all realms of American society and culture and sports has been nothing short of dazzling. And that's a wonderful thing. What I don't think we realized back then is that the economies of so many cities, particularly where our folks live and other folks live, would become so challenged that the jobs that once sustained families would begin to evaporate, that they'd be replaced by jobs that pay far less. I think our challenge now is to recognize that the economic circumstances, while the conditions of African Americans are palpably worse than whites, the conditions that whites are dealing with now and that Latinos are dealing with now, and African Americans and other minorities, if you're working class or middle class, are the same across the board. The economy, there's sort of secular changes in the economy that have made life very, very difficult and insecure. And the challenge now is to recognize the commonality of circumstances and to avoid the efforts of some leaders to demonize this group and say your economic circumstances are the fault of this group. That's not true. They're the fault of trends like globalization and technology and all sorts of other things that are transforming the job market in a way that makes it difficult for everyone. And we need public policies that respond to the economic realities and social realities of everyone. I'm very disappointed, obviously, and sometimes afraid of the uprisings of racial animus in our society, but I'm old enough to have been a young adult when Bull Connor and George Wallace were around, so I've seen ugly.
And last question also on the American timeline, not to date you, but you obviously lived through Watergate and you've seen questions of confidence in government before. Have you ever seen anything like we've seen here the last 100 and some odd days?
No, and I can't imagine that we're going to get through 3.5 more years of this. I mean, I think there's got to be a change. I think the circumstances are building. Now, this is beyond my wildest imagination. It's very sad. But I think we're being tested, how deeply we believe in the fundamental tenets of democracy and the Constitution. And I think we're going to come through the test. I think the media has risen to that. Community-based organizations have risen to it, so I'm optimistic that we're working through. I think we're a robust enough society to resist what's going on and to turn the corner.
Well, if you want to hear an amazing family history and eyewitnesses to huge moments and also through a very fascinating prism, This African American Life, Hugh Price. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I certainly appreciate the time.
It.
You as well. Coming up next, a little change of pace. Willy Wonka has already been a movie starring Gillian Wilder in the 70s and Johnny Depp 30 years later. Now, it's a Broadway musical called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Legendary theater critic John Simon, he'll join us with a review of the play.